Just to clarify, we live in a pretty good neighborhood. To show you how safe it is, a few days before this happened, my dad took me to my drumming lesson. We were gone for about an hour, and when we came back home, we realized that we had left the key in the lock outside the whole time. No one took it nor came in. This has happened before. Now, on to the actual story. One night, at about 11 p.m., my mom and I were in the sitting room. My dad and sis were in bed. My mom was asleep on the couch, and I was playing PUBG Mobile. At one point, I could hear noises coming from the hallway. Thinking it was the cats, I brushed it off. I started to hear more noise and thought, what the fuck are they doing? Then, I saw something roll on the floor by the dining room table, and one of the cats walking up to it. Again, thinking it was the cats. The object, however, was placed on top of a vanity we have in the hallway. They don't go on top of that, but we do have a 9 to 10 month old curious kitten. I then heard a male voice. At first I thought it might be one of my teammates in the game talking. I quickly realized it was not. I then thought my dad had gotten up, which is pretty common for him. So I asked my mom if Dad had come down and if it was him. She sleepily said yes, so I tried to brush it off again. Suddenly, I see this thing flying at me and landing on the floor in front of me. I thought, that can't be the cats. I got up and walked over to the hallway. I got to the step when I realized that my dad's walking stick and straw hat that was on top of our coat hanger were on the floor. I walked up the step and heard movement in the office. It was dark. The office is right next to the front door, about 2 meters from the living room front door. I thought it might be my sister looking for something. And then, this guy gets up, comes out of the room, goes to the front door, unlocks it, and walks out. He was wearing a hoodie and I didn't see his face. I was paralyzed with fear and confusion. My mind immediately went to, do I know him? After he left, I yelled out to my mom that someone just walked in. She was obviously confused and concerned. We realized he came in from the back door, which was unlocked. He either climbed the gate, which is about 2 meters high, or walked up the neighbor's stairs and then over the wall. The only things he took were the back door keys and a Bluetooth player, we believe, which we don't care about. We made a barricade that would make noise if he came back, and sat with knives and a big 2-tooth fork until about 5 a.m. We had another lock, so Dad changed it the next day. I slept with the knife under my bed that night. Looking back, I wish I had done something. I played rugby for 2 years. I know the basics to tackle, but I couldn't move. Obviously because of fear, but my brain was also trying to understand what was happening. I probably could have taken him on. He was very thin and looked to be 17 or 19 at most, judging by his style and body. We think we might know who did it, but they didn't break in. They only took 2 things and walked past all our valuables. He didn't do anything to us. It almost looked like he was trying to get my attention as well. Almost as if it was a bet and he tried to find a reason to get out. Either that or he's the worst robber I've ever seen. I'm just happy my sister was in bed. It probably would have been a different story if she had been there with us. A lot of people think they know how they'd react in certain situations. I'm living proof you don't. I thought I'd scream at least, but nothing. We now lock our doors every night. Every time I hear a noise, I get a little frightened, but I'm okay. If he wanted to hurt me, he would have tried. We got lucky. So from around 2010 up until 2015, I lived in this town, Mexico in Maine. My mom's family lived in a really small town nearby called Carthage. We would go up there for a week or so every summer and chill with our family. In 2015, we ended up moving away to where my dad's family lived. Sometime in 2017, when I was 13, my mom made some plans on Facebook with some relatives, and next thing I know, we're going to Carthage for a few days. On the last day we were there, one of the kids proposed we should go for a walk. I think after a few minutes of convincing, 7 of us, including me and my sister, decided to go along. So we just told our parents and walked out. That seemed weird to me. As a kid, I never just walked in the woods without my parents, but my sister and I just said whatever and went along. After about an hour, we came across a small clearing with some fallen over trees and decided we should take a little break. The oldest of us had to go pee or something, so the rest of us just sat down and chatted. A minute or two later, he comes back and says we should head back now. A few kids were kinda sad, but my chunky ass was fine with leaving. At the time, I didn't even think about why he would so suddenly want to go back. After what felt like forever, we get to the road, where the house was just down the street. But I felt weird. Not frightened or worried, but off. I turned around and saw a deer man. It was just standing there looking at us. I stared at it for maybe a few seconds, but that felt like hours. After a second, I hear, "You coming?" from my sister, and I turned and kept walking. We get back, I get the Instagram of 2 of the other kids, and we eventually leave back home. I instantly DM the dudes and we talk for like a week until I just stopped using Instagram for a while. I forget the deer man almost immediately after, and I move on. Like 5 days ago, one of them DM'd me. We talk for a while, then he mentioned something weird in the woods. Then the memories start flooding in. We both talk to all the other people who we can get a hold of so we can straighten everything out and discuss it. Here's everything we concluded about Deer Guy. It was 6 or 7 feet tall, hairy, had a head that looked like a deer, antlers and all, and had a kinda hunchback. We agree at the very least it resembles the Wendigo of folklore, but I don't think it was. From what I know, they're linked with cannibalism, and as far as I know, none of us teenagers had any plan on eating each other. I would like to know if anyone had something similar, or if this is a known legend in me that I'm just in the dark about. It was a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent, and I was a female in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The doctor's office was an hour away from our home, and I was just taking the 2 youngest of my 3 to our scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, their office always gave us the last appointment of the day, and we were grateful. The doctor had just built a new building off of a fresh spur of the highways, so the location was quite isolated in every direction, but a very nice facility compared to his old spot by the hospital there. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot, and my car was one of only 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot when we got there. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, saw the doctor, paid, and exited back outside. As I loaded the children in their car seats, the receptionist locked the glass doors, but when I tried to start the car, it wouldn't start. Gathering the children again, I knocked on the door until someone allowed us back in and asked to borrow the phone to call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book, and the man said that he would come but that it might be a bit, so I told him my location, left to go back out to the car, rolled down all the windows, and loaded the children back into their seats as we waited. Soon, we watched as all the lights were turned out in the building again and everyone left, leaving us alone in the parking lot. As it was still light, I spent a lot of that time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks and a bottle, making sure that they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant said that it was probably going to be quite a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot pretty soon, and a man got out of his pickup, smiled and nodded to me, and said he was going to raise the hood. He was middle-aged and a bit scruffy, but quite frankly, many gas station attendants sometimes looked that way, especially at the end of the day. And I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine, but he seemed to be taking a long time checking the connections, and I longed for him to just grab jumper cables, yet he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong, and he said, "Oh, it's just a loose wire, not the battery," and continued whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were visible through that long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood as we waited. More than once, he said that it was merely a loose wire, and if I would just come up here really quick, he would show me which one it was, so it would never happen again. I remember kind of laughing it off, though, and saying that sadly there was no reason to show me anything as I didn't know anything about cars. I just thanked him and continued to sit in the driver's seat, again just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition that was most surely coming any moment. At one point I remember thinking that he was flirting, but I was trying above all to be polite and kind, and he was helping us. We were hot and tired and miserable, and truthfully most of my attention was on the children, and so I was distracted as well. And oddly enough, he was starting to sound a little frustrated with me because I wouldn't come up and look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad where he left us there all alone, with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into the desolate parking lot, and as it did, this nice guy working underneath my hood suddenly slammed it shut, ran to his truck, started it, and drove away very quickly, without even saying a word of goodbye. I was both confused and a little anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was now arriving. I remember feeling a little frightened that he had suddenly left me there all alone with two little ones, defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever was parking next to me now? It certainly seemed the southerly gentleman thing to do. I looked around and was very aware, once again, that there were no visible cars on the road, no homes or businesses were nearby, and the sun was continuing to set quickly. As this new pickup pulled in next to me, I got out of the car once again, apprehensively. Upon exiting, though, he immediately introduced himself and his name, and the voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone with much earlier. He then actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road, asking who the man was that had just left so suddenly. Relieved and unfazed, I just laughed and told him, "Well, I don't know, I thought all this time that he was you," and we both laughed as he then grabbed the jumper cables, walked to the front of my car, raised the hood, and started to hook up the battery terminals quickly. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with luck, that the air conditioner would be blowing full blast shortly, and once again checking the children. While listening for the familiar words, "Try it," I had my back turned towards the children when he surprised me by suddenly walking to the driver's side door. In the strangest voice, he said, "Ma'am, is this yours?" And when I looked into his hands, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-like device that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered with reddish rust, yet on one end it had tiny small finger holes. It looked as if it was a mix of a long, thin sword and scissors combined. I remember being amazed, but not frightened, and asked where he had found them. "Under the hood," he replied. I said, just matter-of-factly, that I had never seen them before. But how weird was it that those things had somehow been stuck and undiscovered in my car for all those years? I remember thinking it was rather funny, shaking my head and even smiling a bit. But he continued to stare at them, unbelievingly, and he looked oddly pale too, like he couldn't find the words to speak for a bit, just staring at this bizarrely long, thin sword-like object still within his hands. Honestly, I didn't care one bit about it. All I could think of was getting the car going, letting me pay him, and leaving. He didn't say anything else, just quickly sat them on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled for me to start the Jeep, and when it immediately caught, my 3-year-old cheered. Gratefully, I quickly turned on the air conditioner, full blast, rolled up all the windows, aimed the air vents back towards the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay out. I stood up and took a few steps to meet him so I could hear the amount now owed. With both of our vehicles running, he came back around to my driver's side and, instead of handing me the bill, irritated me a bit by walking right past me and picking up the weird object once more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at these one more time," and held them out for closer inspection. This time, I moved a bit closer and actually really looked in his hands. Even though he was a big guy, the item appeared incredibly long and thin. It almost had a bayonet-looking quality to it, except for the strangely small 2 loops on one end. As he held it, he spoke quietly and slowly to me, trying desperately to make me understand something that apparently was still going over my head. "These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine, ma'am. They hadn't been there very long at all, because they were sitting right on top. They must have just been put there." I shook my head no and smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but see how sharp they are? These look like they've just been sharpened." When I looked down, he was right. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before. The length was certainly long and dagger-like, but the sharpness was undeniably the most frightening quality. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "Ma'am, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, told me that I needed to call the police whenever I got home safely, and then asked me where I wanted the item. I didn't want to touch it, so I released the back window and he placed it inside. I lowered the back window and he placed it inside. We both then left the lot together, him turning one way, me turning the other towards the small highway that would lead to home. We both then left the lot together, him turning one way, me turning the other towards the small highway that would lead home, still an hour away. I did indeed contact the police the moment that we arrived home, and I got the children inside safely. But although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the scissor-like thing to them. The officer I spoke to said that they sounded as if they were specialized surgical shears, from my description and measurements on the phone, which I found quite disturbing, as you can imagine. I tried so carefully not to touch any of the surface, hoping they might be able to lift prints or test the surface for blood, but they really didn't seem interested. The officer simply told me that it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to keep the shears for a few days just in case someone from his office got back with me later. But that was all. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper and placed them in the brick storage unit behind our house, and they remained there for several more years untouched, until we finally moved away and threw them in the trash. But around that time, if you look through the news, women were going missing in Georgia, some never to be found. And of course, all these years later, it is still happening. I have often wondered what would have happened if the service station attendant hadn't arrived when he did, if my children would still have a mother, if I would have still had my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know, but I learned something about myself that day. I always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading circumstances and staying safe. But because I was exhausted and tired and hot and stranded in a different city, my common sense and my intelligence simply left me for a bit and wasn't working at the time. And many of my friends and family still think that it could have cost us our lives.